Claremont, New Hampshire, October 13, 1998, 17 degrees. The sound of the biting wind howled through the trees as I walked down the deserted road, the pale moonlight barely illuminating the winding path. Claremont seemed on the brink of collapse, its atmosphere thick, laden with a malignancy that seemed to have seeped into the soil over the years. Each step echoed in my mind as a reminder of the dark mission that had brought me here. I am the Hunter, a war veteran specialized in eliminating threats that go beyond human understanding. Now, with age weighing heavily on my shoulders and loneliness as my only companion, I feel that time is running out for me. That's why I've decided to share my story, so that when I'm gone, at least someone will know the atrocities I witnessed. The award ceremony in Washington, D.C. had been a sham from the start. The event was soaked in a falseness that barely concealed the real reason I was summoned. Among the plastic smiles and cold handshakes, I realized that the award was nothing more than a distraction. And when the officer handed me a sealed envelope with instructions to open it in private, I knew my suspicions were correct. That night, in my hotel room, I unsealed the envelope with a strange mixture of anticipation and fear. The contents were disturbing. A small village in New Hampshire, Claremont, where mysterious disappearances had been occurring with alarming frequency. More disturbing was the fact that the circumstances described in the reports were undoubtedly of a supernatural nature. I was ordered to go there, investigate, and resolve the situation. A suicide mission for most, but an inevitable call for me. I arrived in Claremont at dusk. The village seemed like a reflection of the underworld itself. The few people remaining wandered the deserted streets with lost looks, steeped in silent dread. As soon as I entered the central square, a crowd of people caught my attention. As I approached, I felt the terror of the crowd, an almost palpable emotion emanating from the center of the gathering. Pushing through the clustered bodies, I came upon a sight that brought me back to the battlefields, where mutilated bodies and death were constant companions. There, on the cold, damp ground, lay one of the missing persons mentioned in the report. His body was contorted in a grotesque pose, bones broken and realigned in impossible ways. His eye sockets were empty, and his mouth, open in a silent scream, was a black abyss, tongueless. The sight filled me with a primal terror, but I stood firm. It wasn't the first time I'd faced something like this, though each new encounter left deeper scars on my mind. "Let me through," I ordered with a cold authority that made the crowd disperse. As I inspected the body, I heard footsteps behind me. The sheriff of Claremont, a burly man with a hard gaze, approached, disdain evident in his expression. "Who the hell are you?" he asked with hostility. "This is local police business." Without hesitation, I pulled out my FBI identification. "I'm the Hunter. I'm here to handle this," I replied, offering no more details than necessary. The sheriff shot me a contemptuous look before letting out a dry laugh. "The feds sent a dog to solve the case, huh? But I'll take care of this. You can leave." I locked eyes with him, cold as the wind blowing around us. "If you had done your job right, I wouldn't be here," I retorted, my voice sharp as a blade. "Now I'm your boss. I want to see the reports you have." With obvious reluctance, the sheriff nodded and led me to the station. There, among dusty files and aged papers, I came across the true nature of the evil lurking in Claremont. The documents revealed a macabre history of dark rituals performed by a cult known as the Worshippers of Moloch, a dark force that had been extinguished in the 80s, or so they thought. However, the recent string of disappearances followed the same pattern as the old ones, suggesting that the cult was far from a problem of the past. Among the reports, one name stood out: Havenbrook, one of the original members of the cult who had betrayed his companions and helped dismantle it. He now vegetated in an asylum for the insane on the outskirts of Claremont, the only survivor of an era of horror. The darkness of Claremont, however, was not confined to the past. Something had awakened again, and I knew that finding Havenbrook was the key to understanding and, perhaps, putting an end to it. The psychiatric institution where Havenbrook was interned was a reflection of madness itself. The long, dimly lit corridors seemed to echo the screams of tormented souls who never found peace. When I finally found Havenbrook, he was but a shadow of a man, murmuring incoherent words about an imminent darkness. I lost the only man who could give me answers, but not the last one. I knew that the church mentioned in the documents was where it all began and where it would all end. The battle in the church was a living nightmare. I faced deformed creatures, remnants of the hounds they once were, and the very demonic force that inhabited the young man. With every blow, every shot, I felt the thin line between life and death slipping away. Even the sheriff, who had covered up the crimes out of love for his lost son, ended up helping me in the end by providing a blessed bullet, the last hope of stopping the abomination. When I finally fired the holy bullet, the creature fell, but not before opening a vortex to another world. With Havenbrook's and the young man's bodies thrown into the abyss, the portal closed and the evil was contained. For now. Now Claremont was silent, an oppressive stillness after the storm. The sheriff, destroyed by the weight of his actions, offered no more resistance. I left the village knowing that for a brief moment I had halted the advance of darkness. But I also knew that darkness doesn't extinguish so easily. It always finds a new place to hide, a new way to resurface. As I walked away from the church, I lit a cigar and made one last call. "It's done," I informed, knowing that, wherever it was, the next call would come. My days as a hunter were not yet over, but at least for tonight, the shadow had been driven away. Forest, near Claremont, New Hampshire. October 14th, 1998, 12 degrees. The waning moon peeked through the twisted trees as I walked away from the church. With each step, the weight of the battle fought still vibrated in my bones, reminding me that no matter how much evil was contained, it never completely disappeared. I knew I should leave Claremont as soon as possible, but something stopped me from just turning my back and moving on. Something in that cursed village still called to me, like a faint whisper I couldn't ignore. The call I made to my high-ranking contact was brief and to the point, but the response I received was unusual, even by my standards. "Stay in the area for one more day. There's one last thing we need you to do." Their words carried a tone of urgency, but also something bordering on desperation. Never before had they asked me to stay in a location after the objective had been accomplished. It was always resolve and leave, keeping me a ghost, a shadow that passed by and left behind only the trail of blood and pain that evil had spread. This time, however, seemed different. Without questioning, I just agreed. Part of me wanted to refuse, to disappear forever and forget Claremont like a distant nightmare. But another part, the one that still clung to the idea of duty and purpose, knew I had to see this through to the end. I decided to walk away from the church, feeling the need to clear my mind. I needed to think, to organize the information I had gathered, and the forest around seemed the only place where I could find some peace. The cold wind blew through the trees, and the sounds of the night filled the air with a rhythmic, almost comforting sound. I walked aimlessly for a while, the darkness thickening around me. Every leaf I stepped on, every branch that snapped under my feet, seemed like echoes of the evil I had just confronted. But then, something else began to stand out in this nocturnal silence, a sensation of being watched, followed. I stopped for a moment, holding my breath. The wind abruptly ceased, and the sound around me dissipated, as if nature itself was retreating from something more sinister. My hands instinctively slid to the hilt of my karambit, ready for anything that might emerge from the shadows. I knew that in Claremont, even the most innocent sounds could hide unimaginable horrors. But there was no attack, no sudden movement, or tangible threat. Only a presence, an almost physical pressure that surrounded me, making the air thick, difficult to breathe. Slowly I looked around, trying to identify the source of that oppression. That's when I saw it. A tall, thin figure standing at a distance between the trees. Its silhouette was just a shadow against the forest's darkness, but there was something undeniably strange about its posture, the way it seemed to be lurking, waiting. From where I stood, I couldn't make out details, just the vague sense that it wasn't human. My instincts screamed for me to retreat, to get away from it. But at the same time, something in my mind pushed me to move forward, to confront this new threat that seemed to emerge from nowhere. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty forest. No answer, just the wind returning, whispering through the leaves. The figure remained still, unchanged. I decided to approach, cautiously, each step measured not to reveal the growing nervousness within me. As I drew closer, I noticed the figure was covered in a dark cloak, its head hooded. The bare feet touched the cold, damp earth of the forest, and its hands, emerging from the wide sleeves of the cloak, were pale as if life had long been drained from them. When I was a few meters away, I stopped. The air around seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy. Even without seeing its face, I could feel its eyes, or whatever was behind that hood, fixed on me, watching my every move. "You shouldn't be here, Hunter," said a deep, raspy voice, echoing from within the hood. "Claremont is no longer your battlefield. What is about to be unleashed is not something you can stop." There was something in those words that filled me with deep fear, a sensation I rarely experienced. But at the same time, I felt the need to confront whatever it was. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding harder by the second. The figure didn't immediately respond. Instead, it slowly raised one of its hands, pointing at me. "I am what remains of a forgotten era, a guardian of secrets that should never have been unearthed," it replied, its voice reverberating in my mind like distant thunder. "You interrupted the ritual, but the marks remain. What you faced in the church was only part of the truth." The figure's words resonated within me, blending with the darkness around me. I tried to stay focused, trying to understand what that meant. "What truth is that?" I insisted, forcing myself to maintain eye contact with the emptiness of the hood. "The truth is that Claremont was built on the foundations of hell itself," the figure continued, its voice now sounding almost like a lament. "The land here is cursed, and those who awaken its shadows only find pain and despair. What you see as the evil that needs to be eradicated is only a fraction of something much larger, much older. And now the gates have been opened." A chill ran down my spine. There was no doubt in the figure's voice, only the certainty of an inevitable fate. "Are you saying there's more of this? More than what I faced in the church?" "More than you can imagine, Cazador," it replied, lowering its hand. "And you will have to make a choice. You can try to escape, leave Claremont and live with what you've done, or you can stay here and face what's to come. But know this, whatever choice you make, the price will be high." The figure's words hung in the air like an unspoken death sentence. Before I could respond, or even formulate a coherent thought, the figure turned and began to walk away, disappearing among the trees as if it had never been there. I stood there, alone in the darkness of the forest, with the stranger's words still ringing in my ears. What it had said disturbed me in a way that no battle or creature ever had. What I had unleashed in Claremont was far from over, and now I was faced with a choice I never thought I'd have to make. I could flee, abandon the cursed village, and try to forget what I had witnessed. Or I could stay, delve even deeper into the abyss, and face whatever was preparing to emerge from the depths. And deep down, I knew the choice had already been made. The night was at its peak when I returned to the village, but the feeling of being watched didn't diminish. On the contrary, it seemed to intensify with every step I took towards the makeshift inn where I was staying. The figure in the forest, its words, what I had faced in the church, all intertwined in a knot of despair that tightened in my chest. I entered the dim room, locking the door behind me. My footsteps echoed on the walls as if the very environment was aware of what was to come. There was something in Claremont that still pulsed, a hidden malignancy beneath the surface, and I couldn't simply ignore it. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I lit another cigar, the smoke curling in the dense air. The remaining documents, now scattered in my mind, formed an incomplete puzzle, but enough to understand that the origin of everything was deeply rooted in this soil. The church, the asylum, the possessed young man, all were just pieces of a much darker plot. Suddenly, the sound of a soft knock on the door brought me back to reality. I stood up immediately, my hand already on the handle of the weapon, ready for anything. Whoever it was, they were venturing into dangerous territory by seeking me out at this hour. I opened the door with a quick, precise movement, ready to react to any threat. But instead of an enemy, I found a young woman. Her appearance was unlike any other Claremont inhabitant. Her eyes were a deep, almost supernatural blue, and there was an urgency about her that contrasted with her fragile appearance. "You need to help me," she said quickly, her voice trembling under the weight of fear. "They're coming. They know you're here." I remained silent for a moment, studying her. "Who are they? Why should I trust you?" She took a deep breath, trying to control the evident panic in her eyes. "My name is Emily. I'm the last descendant of Claremont's founders. They kept me alive to ensure the cycle continued, so the evil could be fed with pure blood. But now they want to sacrifice me to fully open the gates of hell." Her eyes met mine, pleading for help. "You're the only one who can stop this. Please, help me end this curse once and for all." Her words hit me like a direct blow. Everything I had faced so far seemed to be just preparation for something much darker, a final ritual that, if completed, could destroy not only Claremont, but much more. I looked at Emily, then at the room around me. There was no time to hesitate, not after everything I had witnessed. If there was a chance to end this, I would have to take it. "Let's go," I said, placing my hand on her shoulder. "Let's finish this." Claremont, New Hampshire, October 14, 1998, 2:43 a.m., 9 degrees. The early morning advanced like a silent predator as we left the inn, darkness enveloping every inch of Claremont like a shroud of death. Emily walked beside me, her body tense and breath uneven, but her steps didn't falter. I could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there, a determination burning intensely, perhaps the only thing keeping her on her feet. The village was dead. There wasn't a sound, a movement. Everything seemed suspended in a dark limbo, as if time had stopped to watch what was about to happen. The dim lights in the windows of the houses cast grotesque shadows on the empty streets, distorted, as if the village itself was trying to hide from what it knew was coming. "Where are we going?" I asked, keeping my voice low. There was no need to ask if we were being followed. The feeling of being watched hadn't diminished since we left the inn. "To the original foundation of the church," Emily replied without hesitation. "Before it was built, there was a pagan sanctuary there. It's where it all began. It's where they intend to complete the ritual." The church, of course. It was the point of convergence for everything, the epicenter of the evil that had infected Claremont. However, the mention of an even older foundation made me feel a chill that wasn't caused by the icy wind cutting through the night. The soil there had been contaminated for centuries, and now it was thirsty for more blood. "Emily, if we're going to do this, I need to know what exactly we're facing." "Who are they?" I asked, gripping the hilt of the karambit, ready for anything. She paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, as if gathering the courage to speak. "They are the last remnants of the worshippers of Moloch," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But they're no longer human. The rituals corrupted them, turning them into something beyond this world. They feed the evil that inhabits this soil and seek to open a permanent portal to hell." Emily's words hit me like a blow to the soul. Those creatures who were once men and women were now tools of evil itself, distorted and consumed by the darkness they had invoked. And now, They wanted to sacrifice Emily, the last descendant of the founders, to open a portal between worlds, an abyss from which nothing good could emerge. We continued walking in silence, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the cold night. Time seemed to stretch, each second a prelude to what was to come. Finally, we spotted the silhouette of the church, dark and imposing against the starry sky. But unlike the last time I was there, something had changed. The air around the place seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy, as if the building itself was breathing, alive with the presence of evil. The church doors were open, and a faint, reddish light emanated from inside, pulsing like a sick heart. The smell of blood and burning incense mixed in the air, making bile rise in my throat. Emily hesitated at the sight before us, but I placed a hand on her shoulder, conveying all the reassurance I could still muster. "Stay behind me," I said, my voice firm. "We're going to end this." We advanced together, each step echoing like a heartbeat, our eyes fixed on the dark interior of the church. As we crossed the threshold, the air seemed to solidify around us, becoming heavy and oppressive. The scene before us was grotesque. The altar that once held Havenbrook was now covered in symbols carved into the marble, pulsing with a crimson light that seemed alive. Hooded figures moved slowly around, chanting in an ancient tongue, their eyes hidden under deep shadows. In the center of it all, on the altar, there was a ritualistic circle with inscriptions writhing like worms on the ground. And in the middle of that circle, lying bound, was a young woman who, even from a distance, I knew was a decoy, a distraction to keep our attention away from the true sacrifice. "Emily, we don't have much time. We need to stop them now," I whispered, knowing that every second could mean the difference between success and disaster. Before we could advance, one of the hooded figures lifted its face. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, the eyes completely black, devoid of any humanity. The smile that spread across its lips was an abomination in itself, a grotesque distortion of any expression a human being could make. "You're too late," said the figure, its voice deep and distorted. "The ritual has already begun, and the blood of the last descendant will be the catalyst that opens the gates of hell. You cannot stop what has already been set in motion." Before I could respond, the figure raised a curved dagger and pointed it at Emily, who was standing beside me. "She belongs to the Lord of Darkness now." A cold snap ran through my body. They knew all along. Emily was the true sacrifice, and somehow, by bringing her here, I had played the role they expected me to. It was a trap from the beginning, and now time was running out. In a swift motion, I pulled Emily behind me, simultaneously drawing my Smith & Wesson, aiming directly at the heart of the figure who had spoken. "You're not going to touch her," I growled, pulling the trigger. The shot echoed through the church, and the figure fell backward, a shrill scream escaping its lips as black blood gushed from its chest. But before we could celebrate, the other figures began to move, advancing toward us like predators, their daggers gleaming in the pulsing light of the altar. "Emily, run!" I shouted, drawing the karambit with my other hand and preparing to face the creatures. She hesitated for a second, but seeing the figures approaching, she turned and ran toward the exit. Fear etched on her face. I knew I couldn't let her flee alone. The cultists would do anything to capture her. But I also knew that without facing them, none of us would get out of there alive. The hooded figures closed in, and the first attack came quickly. The dagger slashed through the air, but I managed to dodge and counter, driving the carom bit into the side of my opponent's neck. Black blood spurted out, but the cultist didn't scream, collapsing silently to the ground as the others advanced with inhuman fury. The fight was a brutal dance of life and death. Every blow I struck was precise. Every shot from my Smith & Wesson echoed through the church. Yet the creatures seemed endless, emerging from the shadows like inhuman puppets, with distorted smiles that chilled my spine. One after another, they fell, but I knew I couldn't win a battle of numbers. The ritual needed to be interrupted somehow. I saw Emily near the door, hesitant, looking at me with desperation. Her eyes, once filled with fear, were now fixed on something beyond. I knew she was trying to fight the urge to flee, but the gravity of the situation kept her paralyzed. "Emily, the dagger!" I shouted as I faced another figure. "Grab the dagger from the altar and destroy the circle." She seemed to understand and ran toward the altar. As she approached, the remaining figures tried to stop her, but I was already in motion, eliminating anyone who stood between her and her goal. I saw her reach the dagger, lifting it with trembling hands. But before she could deliver the final blow against the circle, one of the remaining figures attacked, its dagger coming fast and deadly. Without thinking, I ran toward them, my carom bit moving as an extension of my arm. The blade found the figure's body, cutting deep, but not before the cultist's dagger drove into Emily's shoulder. She screamed in pain, but with surprising strength, she managed to twist the dagger she held and drove it into the ground, destroying the ritualistic circle. In that instant, an infernal scream reverberated throughout the church. The altar began to shake violently, and the figures still nearby started to convulse, as if they were being pulled by an invisible force. The ground beneath the altar split open, revealing a deep chasm from which a reddish glow emanated, illuminating the distorted faces of the cultists, now writhing in agony. The air around the chasm became heavy and dense, and an invisible force began to pull everything towards it. The hooded figures, who once moved with deadly precision, were now being sucked into the abyss, their screams echoing through the church. I grabbed Emily, trying to pull her away from the edge of the chasm, but the power of the suction force was rapidly increasing. "We have to get out of here now," I shouted, trying to be heard over the growing roar of the chasm. Emily, pale with pain and with blood streaming from her shoulder, struggled to stay on her feet, but her eyes were fixed on the altar. "The portal! It's not closed! The chasm is still open!" she screamed, pointing to the pulsating glow emanating from the crack in the ground. She was right. Though the cultists were being dragged into the abyss, the malevolent energy still boiled around the chasm, and the portal continued to expand. If we didn't do something, it could grow to engulf the entire church and beyond. Holding Emily tightly, I looked around, searching for something that could be used to seal the chasm. That's when my eyes landed on an object on the altar, an ancient grimoire, its pages open revealing arcane symbols that glowed with a faint light. I immediately understood what needed to be done. "Emily, I need you to help me," I said, my voice serious. "That thing there, the book, it's the key to sealing the portal. But we need to destroy the altar completely for it to work." She nodded, her eyes filled with determination despite the visible pain. Together, we staggered toward the altar, struggling against the force pulling us toward the chasm. Every step was a battle against gravity, but we knew we couldn't stop. When we finally reached the altar, I grabbed the grimoire, feeling the pulsating energy emanating from it as if the book was alive, vibrating in my hands. Emily, gritting her teeth in pain, raised the blood-stained dagger and prepared to deliver the final blow. "Now!" I shouted, lifting the grimoire above my head as Emily struck with all the strength she had left. The dagger penetrated deep into the altar stone, causing an explosion of light that momentarily blinded us. I felt the grimoire heat up in my hands, burning my skin as the arcane energy concentrated in its core. Then, with a primal scream, I hurled the grimoire into the chasm. As soon as the book touched the reddish glow, an explosion of energy swept through the church, pushing us back with tremendous force. The infernal roar was replaced by absolute silence as the ground closed up, the chasm sealing shut like a scar finally healing. I fell to my knees, gasping, feeling the solid ground beneath me. Emily was beside me, also gasping, but alive. The portal was closed, and the malevolent energy that permeated the air had disappeared, leaving only the smell of burnt incense and dried blood. The church was in ruins, but the threat had been contained. Finally, the reigning silence was a relief, a sign that the battle was over. "We did it," I whispered, helping Emily to her feet. Her face was pale, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "It's over." She nodded, her eyes shining with tears she couldn't hold back. "Thank you for everything," she said, her voice faltering. "I don't know what would have happened without you." There wasn't much to say. The battle was over, but the price paid was high. Claremont would never be the same, and the evil that had been contained would likely leave deep scars on those who survived. I knew that for Emily, the marks of that day would remain forever. We left the church together, the first rays of light beginning to break the horizon. That place, which once housed so much horror, was now empty and silent, as if the very land had finally found some peace. And as we walked out of Claremont, I knew that peace would be temporary. The mission had been completed, but the weight of what I had witnessed in Claremont would never completely disappear. It was just another chapter in the long and macabre story I carried with me. Before leaving the village, I took one last look at the pale dawn sky. I was free, but freedom came at a price. Somewhere, in some dark corner of the world, evil waited, silent and patient, biding its time to re-emerge. And I would be there, ready to face it until my last breath was drawn.